This is a neuron. You have billions of neurons, which are cells that transmit signals to your brain. Each neuron has several subparts. This is the cell body, which contains the nucleus and the nucleolus. These are dendrites. There are a lot of them branched out in order to increase surface area, since with more, the neuron will receive more signal inputs. This is the axon, a long structure that the action potential travels along. Action potentials are processes of conduction when the neuron is stimulated, and they originate here at the axon hillock. The axon is covered by the myelin sheath, which is fatty, made by Schwann cells, and insulates the axon to increase conduction. This is the axon terminal, the end of the neuron, which is linked to the dendrites of another neuron, or muscle cell, or gland. Now let's zoom in into the axon hillock. This is the cell membrane, which has a membrane potential of negative 70 millivolts inside. Membrane potential is the difference in charge between the inside and outside of the cell, and this number is negative due to there being a greater concentration of positive ions outside compared to inside. The sodium-potassium pump sets this up, which we'll talk about later. Say this neuron belongs to a kid reaching for a pot on the stove. When they touch the pot, their neuron is stimulated due to the heat. In that moment, the neuron's membrane changes its permeability. Sodium channels open, and since there used to be a larger concentration of sodium outside the cell, these ions rush into the cell down their concentration gradient. This stimulus reaches the threshold potential of negative 50 to negative 55 millivolts, triggering a domino effect along the axon as many sodium voltage-gated channels open. The axon becomes more positive due to the influx of ions, and this phase is called depolarization. The voltage continues rising until it reaches its maximum potential of positive 30 millivolts. Then the sodium channels close and the potassium voltage-gated channels open. The potassium ions flow out of the cell, and with the ions leaving, the inside membrane potential becomes negative again. This is called repolarization. However, the potassium channels are leaky and slow to close, thus too much potassium leaves and the cell becomes too negative. This is called hyperpolarization, as the voltage dips below negative 70 millivolts and can reach up to negative 90 millivolts. This period is also called the refractory period, since the hyperpolarization ensures the neuron doesn't fire again too soon, keeping the conduction going one way across the neuron. So, the action potential has just fired. The impulse is now at the axon terminal, which we'll come back to. But at our spot at the axon hillock, there remains more sodium inside the cell and more potassium outside the cell. A pump called the sodium-potassium pump rectifies this. This pump pumps 3 sodium ions back outside while pumping 2 potassium ions inside. Since this goes against the ion's concentration gradients and also uses ATP to work, this is an example of active transport. And there you go, the ion concentrations are back to normal with sodium outside and potassium inside, ready for another stimulus at negative 70 millivolts. Now let's go look at the axon terminal, zooming in on one end where it makes contact with the end of another neuron, gland, or muscle cell. This junction is called a synapse, and the gap between the two is called the synaptic cleft. Our neuron is the presynaptic, while the new neuron is the postsynaptic cell. Once the action potential comes, voltage-gated calcium channels open, causing calcium to come into the presynaptic cell and bind to vesicles. These vesicles contain neurotransmitters, which act as messengers. The vesicles activate, fusing with the presynaptic membrane, and the neurotransmitters diffuse across the synaptic cleft. They bind with receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. The receptors open their own ion channels and change the membrane potential of the new neuron. The neurotransmitters are either enzymatically degraded after this or are recycled back into the presynaptic cell. The action potential fires across billions of neurons, and the kid probably pulls their hand away from the stove as a reflex. And that's how neurons work. Thank you.